Hello, my name is Scott Fenton. I'm a fellow Homeland Security practitioner and someone who likes to explore different ways to see and think about the world. In my thesis, I brought together ideas from public health and my background in fire science to look at a very important current issue: misinformation. Now, given the title of this thesis, you might think my research was inspired by the global COVID-19 pandemic and all of the misinformation surrounding the coronavirus, vaccines, treatment, and prevention tactics. But no, to find the roots of my topic, we must go back, way back to when disinformation and misinformation were deeply entrenching themselves in all manner of other polarizing topics related to Homeland Security: immigration, climate change, gun violence, reproductive rights, how much government is too much government, how hard or easy should it be to vote. Regardless of how you feel about any of these issues, many of which are at the roots of our democracy, there was plenty of objectively false or misleading information going around. Misinformation upon which people were basing decisions related to their health or the health of others. Misinformation upon which people were forming opinions critical to the free elections central to our democracy. And even after the elections, false declarations and narratives continue to divide us as citizens. So this was the problem that drove my thesis: misinformation as a threat to Homeland Security. It was a problem that was akin to a disease, and it was a disease that was becoming an epidemic. In the lexicon of social media platforms, popular and generally harmless posts were already being described as viral, but as these vectors began carrying misinformation, they were no longer innocuous. So if misinformation were disease-like in its behavior, could a public health perspective be used to disrupt it? This led to my thesis problem statement: how can we better understand and address the proliferation of misinformation by viewing it through an epidemiological lens? And the idea of an alternative lens was attractive to me because it was a great way to simplify a very complex issue, and in so doing maybe expose its weaknesses. Now, I'm a fire captain, and in the fire service, we're simple folk. We're the guys that came up with this thing called a fire triangle. We figured out that fire needs three basic things: heat, fuel, and oxygen. And if you remove any of those elements, everything collapses, just like a two-legged triangle would. One can think of other similar interdependent systems. For example, in a successful ecosystem, all species are dependent on each other to survive. Architectural designs are carefully engineered but easily weakened if the right component is compromised. A quarterback by himself does not make a winning football team, unless your quarterback is Tom Brady. In the epidemiological world, there is a handy analog to the fire triangle known as the epidemiological triangle. And if you pick up a textbook on epidemiology, you will find this simple model for what disease needs to replicate and spread. Like fire, if a virus is to exist and thrive, it also needs three things: an agent, a host organism, and an environment conducive to reproduction. So let's take each of those separately as they relate to misinformation. What I found when looking at this triangle and trying to knock one of its legs loose is that the agent is the hardest side of that triangle to weaken. Fast forward to what we have seen with COVID-19, our efforts have not been to wipe out the viral agent itself, but rather to focus on how we can keep from hosting it and spreading it. With misinformation, if an agent, either foreign or domestic, state or individual actor, decides they are going to start a meme or a deep fake video aimed at a particular audience, there's not much we could do, right? So the misinformation agent is a difficult section of the triangle to dismantle. Addressing the host side of the epidemiological triangle means looking at ways to slow or stop the spread of infection in a pandemic. Worldwide efforts to impede host transmission have consisted of masks to confine any respiratory component and vaccinations to boost the immunity of potential human hosts. Likewise, hosts with poor cognitive hygiene can be responsible for the spread of misinformation. And that vulnerability starts right up here. At the root of what we could call learned susceptibility is something called cognitive bias, which makes us really want to believe the information that supports our worldview. So much so that we don't look very hard for verification of statements we read, or worse yet, we don't try at all. And then we become hosts and spreaders of misinformation, zombies who, unlike a virus, don't care about scientific principles. A virus follows a somewhat predictable scientific path. It doesn't care about your beliefs or biases, but misinformation absolutely thrives on them. So boosting immunity of human hosts through media literacy efforts and other tactics that encourage people to think more critically about the content they ingest becomes a key point of attack on viral misinformation. The last side of that epidemiological triangle is the environment. And it has only been since after this thesis was published that some of its recommendations on making an environment less favorable to misinformation spread have been put into play. To see this side of the triangle, we don't need to look much further than the biggest super spreader petri dish out there, social media. Not only did algorithms on many of these platforms not detect viral misinformation, they also contributed greatly to its spread. Cognitive bias in all of its forms is actually machine learned and amplified on social media. The more affinity you show for certain content, the more of it you are fed, which of course strengthens your cognitive bias even further and entrenches you in your own reinforced social media bubble. As Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others started finding and tagging false or misleading content, many cried censorship, which is a term usually reserved for the mainstream press. And they suggested that these actions amounted to First Amendment violations. Now, free speech means different things to different people in different countries. For instance, in the US, hate speech is not illegal, whereas in many other countries it is. But that's another 10-minute video at least. So complete removal of the environmental leg of the epidemiological triangle is difficult and fraught with politics and opinions. But we have made some recent strides in flagging false or misleading information in order to make that environment less habitable. Which brings us back to the side of the triangle we need to collectively work hard to disrupt with facts, the host side. As citizens and humans, we are of course allowed to have our own opinions, but we should not be allowed to have our own set of facts. And can facts change over time? Absolutely. That's why most of us no longer believe the world is flat. But our best understanding of those things we can measure objectively is the foundation upon which we should layer things like opinions, beliefs, morals, liberties, and the other intangible variables upon which democracies and decisions are built. And as if to support the concepts presented in this thesis, the COVID-19 virus was first reported to the World Health Organization just 11 days after my cohort graduated. And since that time, I think we could all agree that there has been plenty of misinformation about this virus, which became an international pandemic and has killed millions. Back to our triangle one more time. Misinformation contributed in many cases to enhancing the environment that the virus needed to thrive, replicate, and now mutate. It's not always easy to provide fail-safe physical or cognitive immunity to an evolving threat. And as we've seen, sometimes the hosts don't even believe there is a threat. But finding and increasing immunity is the most accessible route to solving these problems, no matter what lens you look through. Like fighting a pandemic, misinformation contagion can only be stopped if individuals view their personal choices as an essential contribution to the defense against narratives that erode the common interests we should all share.